Hold on. We were being kicked out. Sorry. Monique has worked in partnership with communities to co-create meaningful change by defeating polluting industries, stopping freeway expansion, and co-developing with the communities sustainable alternatives, developing popular education material to advance justice-centered movement demands, and challenging and changing planning methodology and practice to center the stories and solution of BIPOC and other communities that experience marginalization. Monique also brings this justice-centered approach and practice into the classroom as a lecturer at Antioch and at Carpanoa. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Monique.
Thank you so much, Yves, and thank you all for taking some time to be here this morning. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. And my coffee is just arriving too. 1 second. All right. Okay, so yeah, and thank you for that introduction, Yves. I'm also a recovering planner, a fellow planner, as well as Yves mentioned. So, I also have my own practice and teach at the LA campus for the Urban Sustainability Master's Program, a course in urban infrastructure, and a course in democratizing community planning, which I helped develop the curriculum from as well. In addition to my role at Antioch University and the work I'm doing at Pueblo Planning, I'm also on the American Planning Association's committee to review the curriculum for AICP certification as well. So definitely active in both practitioner and curriculum development space and bringing those practices together. I started my journey about 15 years ago or so. I'm from an environmental justice community. At the time, I didn't understand or know what that meant, but certainly my body did, and the folks around me did as well in terms of the impacts of how it was impacting our health and our community health at large. And I got involved in planning. I didn't know what it was. I got involved in planning really by accident. There was a industry that wanted to come into my community that was highly toxic and polluting. And I ended up going to a community meeting at a bar where all revolutions happen, and got involved in a grassroots campaign there. And as I got involved in that campaign, I would find myself going to the planning department to ask for where this company was in their permitting process and better understand what was going on in my community. I'd go back 3, 4, 5 times, and because I didn't have the language of planning, I wasn't granted access to those documents until finally I wore them down and they gave me what they knew all along I was asking for. And then at this time as well, I realized and learned that what was being proposed in my community was planned 5 to 10 years prior. But oftentimes how planning was done and is done in communities like where I'm from, there'll be a small little public hearing notice in the newspaper. The meeting would be at the county offices, which was about 30 miles away from my small community, in the middle of the day. And so really, even though there was a public engagement process for folks to be involved in land use planning, the process was one that was set up where the opportunities to engage were very limited. And so at the same time that I'm having this experience with planning and planners, I'm also having this simultaneous empowering experience where with my neighbors, with my friends, we ended up co-authoring, co-developing a ballot initiative to change essentially the land use and public health codes for the county and Imperial County. So in that experience, I'm seeing that community members have a vision for what kind of community that they want to create, but also have the solutions as well. And if we have spaces in which those solutions can be facilitated, and that the brilliance of the community can shine in these spaces, imagine the types of land use policies that would lead to better equity and justice outcomes as well. So I was having these two experiences at the same time. I ended up getting involved in more professionally on air quality policy and I kept running into planners, and I'm like, who are these creatures, right? Named planners. And again, I realized that a lot of the decisions and the recommendations, you know, and to John's point about individual responsibility, really oftentimes came to those individuals at those planning tables. And I'll talk more about individual responsibility and also collective responsibility in my conversation as well. So that's a bit of my origin story, and decided to go back to school and study planning to better understand the language and the process as well, so that I could be you know, a better steward and a better ally in these spaces as well. So I want to provide some just general background, and you all may have gotten this link already from the Antiochening, and if not, I can place the link in the chat box when I'm done with the talk. But I'm going to present to you all a case study on why methods matter and how they can heal or harm communities. And in this case study, I'm going to talk about the tenets of mobility justice. Sometimes it's not enough to just say, okay, here's this list of what mobility justice is. Sometimes it's helpful to contextualize it within a case study and how one could go about doing that. So a lot in the case study that I'm going to be sharing with you all today is a lot about repairing harm and not erasing history. It's a lot about you know, ensuring that we're cultivating collective power, and then also discarding best practices and responding to local needs. And so what I mean by that, in which when I say this to a room full of planners or folks who are in planning spaces, they get a little nervous. What I mean by that is not having discarding best practices in terms of outcomes, not in terms of process. There's certainly best practices in terms of process that folks should integrate into the work that they are doing. And I'm going to provide you all with very tangible examples of process best practices. What I mean by outcomes is like, well, a best practice in, you know, transportation planning is that if we have this type of infrastructure or if we have this type of program, those are outcome based. And what I'm saying is start with the process and allow the community to co-create with you what those best practices locally for those particular outcomes. Again, it really shifts the focus from in this case, in terms of a mobility justice framework, from the particular modalities of transportation that are used, but really centering the lived experience of the individual, and in particular, the lived experience of those that will be most impacted from any planning, policy, design, budgetary decision. It examines the context and options of space. And so really it's about moving beyond infrastructure. Oftentimes as planners, we often want to tie things to the conversation around infrastructure, which is okay, but we also need to think about how are people, especially people who are Black, Indigenous, and non-Black people of color, folks who are unhoused, folks who are in the LGBT community, folks who maybe have different abilities, how are they moving through space as well? And what are also some non-infrastructure things that are impacting their ability to move freely in their community? And these two elements of mobility justice principles is really the core of the case study I'll be sharing with you all today, is really about valuing community voice as an essential component of data, and also co-creating with community new decision-making processes and also what those outcomes are going to be. Again, I want to emphasize as well, mobility justice is more than just infrastructure, and you'll see this in this case study. So the case study I'm going to share with you is a project I worked on behalf of Los Angeles Metro, which is a transit agency in LA. And I want you to memorize this slide because this is really important data points here. So, you know, Metro realized that they didn't have specific data on and information on how women travel and use their transit system. And more than 50% of those who ride Metro in Los Angeles are actually those who identify as women, but they didn't have specific information on them. And so they commissioned this study, this research study and report. So Pueblo Planning, the firm that I'm with, was one firm out of a handful of firms that was engaging in research. And I'll be sharing with you all our methods and our research and impact of that. But one of the first things that we do, and again, linking this back to the mobility justice principles, one of the first things we do is try to just identify what is the population that we are seeking to engage. And in this case, we wanted to really look at, okay, who is riding transit in Los Angeles? And we found from the research that you know, it's typically those who are earning about, you know, $17,000 to $18,000 per year, whereas the median earnings for all workers in LA was double that, right? It's primarily low-income individuals who are foreign-born, people who lack access to private cars, and when comparing this group of individuals who are riding transit to other areas, there's by and large lower earnings and higher poverty rates of LA commuters in comparisons to other big metropolitan areas. So I want you to remember who are the folks riding transit in LA, and this is the demographic here. But in our work, so we want to intentionally engage those who are actually riding transit and looking at, like, okay, do they match these demographics? But in our work too, we Los Angeles being the big mega place that it is, we also wanted to be super intentional, and this is to Josh's point about, like, with limited resources, with limited capacity, how do you do this work, right? Because even this population is really large. So we wanted to identify subpopulations of folks who, even within this population, could potentially be the most vulnerable, or really the riders who would be most impacted from these types of planning decisions around transit. So we looked at unhoused women, immigrant and undocumented women, and women who have a variety of disabilities as well, to really hone in as in including in the conversation through this intentional engagement. And what we did is we started one of the first things we do, because we know that a lot of this work is in order to get some meaningful feedback and direction on the project, you know, we're going to have some might be sensitive conversations, right? And so it's really important that all our work is predicated upon relationships. And we always partner with community-based organizations that have those long-term relationships, even beyond the life of the project itself. And we work with those community-based organizations, and we compensate them and build them into the budget as well. But that's not just where it stops in terms of compensation. We also build into the process as well, and our timeline and budget as well, where they can actually help inform what our engagement is going to be there in the space. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how that ended up shifting how we engage community members in the space. All our work, and as I mentioned before, kind of with my origin story, how many of you have either been in a planning room or even set up these planning scenarios, right? Where there's 20 boards in a room and a whole bunch of stickers and a few comment cards, and you walk in there, and even as myself, as a trained planner and someone who's been practicing planner for the past 15 years, when I walk into those spaces, I am overwhelmed, right? And and I feel like I'm not able to really engage with what is going on. And so one of the things we try to do, or even just the language that's used, and one of the things that we try to do is to break down those barriers, and we use art making and storytelling. So in this particular case, we used images that we sourced. I had a whole bunch of images on the table, and then also tactile elements as well that the women could use. And we essentially asked them two broad questions: what's your experience taking public transit, and how could it be made better? Instead of having pre-designated things on a board. But in this process, before we even engaged or stepped foot into space and engaged the women in this process, we worked with community-based organizations where they helped guide what our engagement process was going to look like. How we asked the questions. For example, with the community-based organization we partnered with for the unhoused women, they had a whole trauma-informed approach handbook that they provided us, that we made sure we were going into that space, understanding the principles and providing support for women if they shared something that needed support. When we worked with the Southern California Independent Living Center, and we were talking to them about, hey, this is what we're thinking of how we're going to facilitate the workshop. And they shared with us that a couple of women who have visual impairments are going to be a part of the workshop, where much of our workshop was very visual. So then we modified our approach, and that's where we had tactile elements that they could engage in collage making as well in the storytelling, and share their experience taking public transit by making a tactile collage, which was really incredible. We didn't have like a separate kit for them. We actually incorporated the tactile elements into the entire art making kit. And so that actually enhanced the experience for everyone when we made sure that those that maybe would be more challenged in this particular way of engaging were included. So when you adapt things for those who need most, you actually enhance the activity for everyone as well. And I want to talk about relationships and reparative reciprocity and respect. So all these R's here. Again, in order to get into these rooms and these spaces and engage with those that are most vulnerable, it really needs to be based upon relationships. Again, we partner with these community and grassroots organizations, but I'm gonna tell you a little story about sometimes how difficult even just building the relationships with the community-based organization can be. We knew that we really wanted to engage undocumented and immigrant women because of the high population, or the high ridership population that group has, but also because we knew that they could potentially be most impacted by any decisions Metro would make. I have a good friend who works for CHIRLA, which is an immigrant rights organization, who connected me to two women who have this informal parent network in Southeast LA. The main mode of communication for a full month was questions back and forth on Facebook Messenger. And then finally, they're like, okay, we'd like to meet you in person. Can you come to the Carl's Jr. on Slauson at 7 a.m. on Tuesday morning? I'm like, absolutely, I'll be there. So at Carl's Jr.'s, I meet them. We engage in an hour conversation over, French toast sticks or whatever's at Carl's Jr. that early in the morning. And by the end of the conversation, they're like, okay, you can come to our meeting space and we will connect you with this group of women. So that took about a month out of multiple online conversations, one meeting in person, before we were granted access into these spaces. So I want to encourage you to build in relationship building into your timeline and your budgets as you're doing this work as well. It can be done, but it requires that time to do that. And as a result, and actually you see an image here, at that particular workshop, as a result, we were able to be granted access. I want to talk about reparative, that making sure that we do things in a reparative manner. Planning can oftentimes be this very extractive process, meaning you go into a community, you ask them a whole bunch of questions, you take that information, and oftentimes we're asking folks to share their traumas, right? You take that information and you go and you put it in your nice report, and then what happens, right? So it's our role and responsibility to not practice extraction. And a lot of you are involved in climate justice spaces or climate change spaces. So if we're trying to move from extractive practice in order to heal the environment, why would we do the same in terms of extractive practice in terms of how we relate to people, right? That leads to harm. So one of the things that we do as we facilitate these spaces is thinking about how is this space leading to immediate healing, if possible, and community building as well. And how is this being reparative? And let me share how that was done in this particular case. In terms of the art making itself, we provided people about 30 minutes to reflect on these two questions. What makes, what's your experience taking public transit? How can it be made better? They're going through this art making process. And then after that, every single person gets to share what they put on their board. And it's through this storytelling that it could be really reparative and very healing. Because as a woman was sharing their particular story, another woman would say, that happened to me. And then another woman would say, that happened to me, and this is what I did in this case. And so how are we allowing for people's voices to be validated in the planning process as well, and for that community building and real-time troubleshooting as well to happen in these spaces as well? And as a planner, I'm also learning and have the privilege to learn about their experiences and also their solutions to that. The other thing as well, in terms of our individual responsibility and also our collective responsibility, is how are we practicing reciprocity in these spaces as well? And this goes hand in hand with the reparative nature. Now, one way that we, build into our budgets in a very, very basic way to practice reciprocity is that we see that the folks that are participating in these engagement processes are experts, and they're taking their time to share their expertise. And as experts, they should be compensated for that. So in this particular case, every single woman who participated in this process, we provided a $25 Metro Transit card. We build that into our budget. Because our clients was Metro, we were able to negotiate with them, for $25 card, we were able to use $10 of our budget for that and leverage that and be creative with that, what that is. But we also asked, the community-based organizations, like, would that be a meaningful token of appreciation? And for the group that with the women with different abilities shared, actually, they take the Access van service, so they don't need the Metro tap card. What they would appreciate is a gift card to a store, that they frequent. So we end up asking them to, like, what would be a meaningful way to provide that. But another way to bake in reciprocity that we often don't think about, especially in planning spaces, is that in terms of as women are sharing certain experiences, and let's say someone is sharing about an experience of food insecurity, or sharing a traumatic experience about being assaulted or something on transit. We don't just go, yeah, thank you, and then take our notes and then leave and then talk about in our reports about the importance of public transit and accessing foods, and all of that. We say, you know what, I heard that you shared that you're having trouble, getting groceries home every week. Here's a list of a few organizations and phone numbers that can help with that. So already having in our back pocket entities we can connect people with, and not just walking out and extracting that information, but really, how do we provide a space? And reciprocity is all about mutual benefit, right? And those who do traditional ecological knowledge and infuse that type of framework into your work know all about reciprocity. But how do we have mutual benefit for the people that are involved in the process? And again, respect is one of the things we do. Is before we publish anything or share it with our clients, we go back to the women and the community-based organizations and say, this is what we heard. Did we get this right? Here's a quote we'd like to use from this conversation. Is that okay? And here's the context of which it's fitted in our narrative. Is that okay? Did we get this right? So we allowed them the ability to check our work essentially before things are published and all of that. And that built in respect and trust into the process, where people are more inclined to be engaged the next time there is a planning process as well. Asking open-ended questions is really key. And I know that this can be really scary, particularly in planning spaces. And I would say any planning space, there's always politics involved, where you don't know by asking open-ended questions, right, what people are going to share, right? But I'm going to tell you why this is so important. We just asked folks 2 questions. Again, what's your experience taking public transit? How could it be made better? If we would have gone in and asked very specific questions, we may have missed an opportunity for someone to share an experience that we do not even have. We weren't even considering. I'm going to give you a story of something that really happened as part of this project. So we're doing this art making process, and one of the things we do with our workshops too is we make them child inclusive. So children are right there with their parents and can engage in also sharing what it's like to take public transit. And one woman was sharing her board and sharing her story. And she shared that her 10-year-old son is on the autism spectrum. And that when they go on the bus, it's a very overwhelming experience for him. It's very loud. There's a lot of different, smells. The lights are really bright. There's a lot of people that are really close. And it's so overwhelming for him. And that he ends up, because he's overwhelmed, crying and throwing a tantrum, throwing himself on the floor. And she has her 2 other kids with her, right? And she's like, and she's in tears. She's like, everyone's staring at me like I'm a bad mother. And I don't, they don't know that this is really hard for him to be in this space. So she's trying to manage her 10-year-old son while she's also traveling with her 2 other children as well on the bus and all. And she says, my son is eligible to take the access van, which, it's a smaller space. And I can travel with him on the access van. But access only allows 1 other individual to travel with my son. That means I can't take the access van because I'm also traveling with my 2 other children. And she's like, if access were to change their policy and allow me to travel as a family, that this would change my ability to access different spaces. Because she's like, right now, I only go out when I know that I absolutely have to. And so all her decisions are being calculated in that way. So she shared her experience of what it's like to travel with her son on the autism spectrum, but she also shared a very tangible, very doable policy solution to that issue, right? And I would not, someone who doesn't have a child on the autism spectrum, I didn't think to ask that question about what's it like to travel with children in these spaces. And when we allow that open-ended type of questions, the richness and deepness that you will get in those responses is really, really incredible. And you will realize how many gaps are in your own understanding of what it's like and what is necessary in order to be mobile. The other thing we did as well is in terms of pop-up engagement. So we also went to 3 key transit hubs on the metro system. Again, we asked the same questions, and we had this engaging board here where we asked people what their experience is like, and people shared. We were very strategic in our location. One, we wanted to place our engagement area in a place where people would be waiting to board the train or the bus. And so we knew that they would be waiting there So we would catch people in that that interim waiting period as well. And as we began to put things on the board, that would bring other people in who would read and like kind of look and engage with the board as well. And so these questions really, or these interactions here were really, we didn't go as deep into what folks shared out in the workshops, but it provided a really cursory understanding of what people's experiences are taking public transit. And also because of the brevity of the engagement, people are sharing their top priorities in these spaces as well. And so as planners as well, we love our comment cards. And oftentimes what my client would ask is, how many comment cards did you get? You know, and what did the comment cards say? And I really want to emphasize that it is the conversations, not the comment cards, where the gold mine is. Sorry, somebody just tried calling me, so I moved my screen. Can you see my screen okay? All right, cool. So it's the conversations, not the comment cards, that matter. And so what I mean by that is that, you know, oftentimes if someone writes on the comment card, or if we're writing on the comment card, we're writing these really brief, like high-level statements, and we're not able to fully capture the story or the complexity of the stories maybe being told to us. So one of the things that I have my team do, and after we engage in these, I tell my team, try to remember in great detail at least 5 stories that you engaged with people. And immediately after these pop-up engagement events, we write as much as we can recall of these stories here. And people ask, well, why don't you just record it? Well, the thing is we're meeting people on the street. We're trying to build trust very quickly. To go through the whole process, and then having a recorder really puts some barriers and makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable and all. So it's about the conversations, not the comment cards. So I know you can't see the details of this map, and that's okay. But I wanna show you, because this gets to Josh's point, right? Is like, we wanna do meaningful engagement, but we have limited resources. So how do we target that engagement in a way that's impactful and meaningful? When you do intentional engagement, you are going to have a deep understanding of the entire system you're trying to understand, whether that be a transit system, whether that be an economic system within a neighborhood. You're going to have a deep understanding. So when we engage people at the workshops, we didn't ask people when they signed in, we didn't ask people for their addresses, because we knew some were unhoused, we knew some were undocumented, and people didn't want to share that. Instead, what we asked them is, what are the transit lines that you most frequent? And so they wrote down that, and we ended up mapping that out. And then we also see the 3 different places we had the pop-ups. So we wanted to have kind of geographical dispersion. From the workshops, the transit lines that the women that we engaged very intentionally represented 65 out of Metro's 165 bus routes. So the riders that we engaged rode up almost about 40% of Metro's bus routes. And if you know about LA is a big sprawling county, right? So we were able to understand the experience, at least of the folks that travel 40% of the bus routes, and all 4 Metro light rail lines and 2 subway lines. We were able to understand that. So when you do that intentional engagement, and when I mean intentional engagement is with populations that are using the system, who could potentially benefit most or be harmed most by any decisions, you are actually understanding your system in a much deeper way than if you don't do that level of engagement. Now, as I mentioned, and I'll wrap up in 5 minutes if that's okay. As I mentioned, there were other groups, other firms doing research around how women travel. There was one group that was like a survey group that did a 120 plus question online survey. And I want to point your eyes to this box here. So it says, as Metro's existing data sources primarily cover rider trends, non-riders were surveyed as part of this effort. Survey sample demographics do not match those of Metro's overall ridership, particularly in categories of income, race, but rather match the demographic distribution across LA County. So those who they surveyed were all those who had access to an online platform of some sort, right? Like they were emailed, right? And they didn't match the racial and ethnic or even demographic, the economic demographic of the writers themselves. Who remembers from that first slide? What are the demographics of the writers? Who remembers from that first slide? John.
Lower income. I guess they were Latinos or African American.
Mm-hmm. And oftentimes foreign-born immigrant, right? Absolutely. And so yeah, go ahead.
Also, women with children who don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Sue, did I see you? Okay, cool. So
if I remember, no private cars, people with no private cars.
Absolutely. So people like where public transit is their main mode of transportation, right? So why does this matter? And I'm going to show you why this matters in the context around public safety. The survey results showed that because the conversation around safety came up in our workshops and pop-ups as well. The folks who took the survey showed that they wanted increased transit policing. They wanted more lighting, and then other people nearby. This is actually a slide that Metro staff member made and presented at this webinar. And then they put all our data into this box right here. Participants in workshops and pop-up events expressed investment in non-law enforcement staff presence and other solutions. This is problematic because one is they're not sharing that the demographics of those who participated. Also, they're not sharing that this came from, oh, here they go, the survey. They're not sharing about the methodology here as they were presenting this out. And they're moving forward policy, quote unquote, solutions to address the issue of safety. But what we heard from folks who are actual riders and those who are probably the most vulnerable riders, they didn't say more transit police. They said, in order to improve public safety, you have to improve frequency and efficiency so that we're not waiting so long at the bus stop or transit stop by ourselves. We need more helpers, so people like in polo shirts who can, if you have, if you have an issue with your tap card or you need directions, or maybe you feel like you're being harassed by someone, you can walk over to. So people who aren't armed, but are more customer service, more lighting, and then also seats on train cars, seats and train cars that are reserved exclusively for women. Because a lot of women shared, like, at the end of the day, I'm so tired. I don't want to always have to be hyper vigilant and looking at my surroundings all the time. If I knew I could just sit in one place and just kind of know I can relax a little bit. What we heard from the women who take public transit, and again, that cohort of folks who could be most impacted by these decisions, they shared that they actually felt less safe with more policing. And one woman shared that she would actually walk an extra half mile to the next transit stop if a friend told her that there's law enforcement at the transit stop that she was at, that she was planning to go to. And they're walking longer in areas that have crumbling infrastructure or missing infrastructure, such as sidewalks and crosswalks and the like, right? Putting their body in also a different type of physical danger. So I bring this up not to say that survey methodology should never be used. It should, but the questions that are asked should be co-developed in partnership with the community-based organizations that have the relationships with these individuals, and best case scenario, co-developed with that cohort of populations that I shared with you, that they could co-develop what those questions should and can look like. And also the instrument in which you are asking for that feedback. This was all online based upon an email. That also matters too, because that's going to then dictate what kind of demographic that you get to engage in these conversations, right? And so also the mode in which you are asking people to take the survey is also really important. So who's helping you co-create it and who's helping you disseminate it, and making sure that your demographics actually match those that are most, could be most impacted. And I say, I want to really emphasize this point, is centering the voices of those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of planning, design, and policy decisions is key. Because if you go back, if Metro as a transit agency were to seriously build this into their budget and their planning and their programs, right? These four elements, instead of investing more on transit police, this would actually make the system, yeah, Shelly, thank you. This would actually make the system better for everyone, regardless of one's demographic. However, the solutions that came out of a demographic that is more privileged than those who actually are in this more vulnerable cohort, that only benefits those that are most privileged in this decision. And then lastly, in terms of our responsibility, is the ongoing stewardship of these community stories. This project happened about 2 years ago. I wrapped up this project, but I'm still engaging at Metro at the board level, because this report, and specifically the survey itself, is being used to legitimize millions of dollars, about $500 million more dollars to transit police. And I'm going in there and saying, look, that's not what the actual writers said that they wanted and needed in terms of public safety. So even though I'm no longer a part of that project, I'm making sure that I'm continuing to steward those stories. I know I went a little bit over time. I apologize. I hope you all have some space outside of this time to engage in these types of conversations.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Monique. So we're going to change a little bit the format. We're supposed to go into small groups and discuss. And I think it would be good not to just discuss as a whole group, but just go in those small groups and we talk about the questions we have. And I'm going to add one question to what you will be talking the next 5 minutes, then we come back and wrap up. So the question to add is, looking at this case study through an equity framework, what question and consideration came up? And I will post that question. So looking at this case study through an equity frame, what questions and consideration came up? So Sherry is going to help us going into the small groups. And then we're asked that we have one person to kind of take a note, and then we come back together and report. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can someone put the question in the chat?
Yeah. So looking at case study.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and head out, but thanks for having me in this space. And yeah.
Thank you, Monique.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, take care. Have a good day.
All right, I'm waiting for the question, but it looks like he's gone. So I'll just join my group.
Hello, Peter.